The American Enterprise Institute presents the Distinguished Lecture Series on the Bicentennial of the United States. Our host for this thought-provoking series is Vermont Royster, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist with the Wall Street Journal and professor of journalism and public affairs at the University of North Carolina.
I'm Vermont Royster with another in the American Enterprise Institute's Distinguished Lecture Series on the American Bicentennial. 1976, the 200th birthday of the United States. Perhaps no government in history has grasped so quickly the potential for bringing ordinary people, not just elite, into the political and economic process. The American experiment has worked, and the American Enterprise Institute has gathered some of our greatest scholars and educators to help us understand why. This lecture will be delivered by Dr. Gordon S. Wood, professor of history at Brown University in Providence, Rhode Island. Tonight's lecture is a special honor for Dr. Wood and for AEI, since it is being delivered before a specially called joint session of the Kentucky State Legislature in Frankfort. Members of both houses are gathered tonight to hear Dr. Wood discuss the role of politics in the development of our democratic system. The American Bicentennial coincides generally with the 200th anniversary of the arrival of the first settlers in Kentucky. It is a time for joy and for pride. Kentuckians take a deep pride in their state, its lush countryside, its products, and its people. One speaker at tonight's joint session referred to Kentucky as the most wonderful land in the confines of all the earth and quite possibly in the confines of all God's creation. Even allowing for a touch of homespun hyperbole, there's much to be said for the clear streams and farm-dotted hillsides that make up much of the state. Kentucky's famous bluegrass country is the home of some of the world's finest racehorses, and the state is also the home of some of the world's mildest tobacco and smoothest bourbon. But times are not always as peaceful here as they are today. In the late 1600s, when Kentucky was first being explored, it was given the name the Dark and Bloody Ground because of the fierce battles among the Indian tribes that lived there. Kentucky's violent history, however, gave rise to some strong and determined men. Although he was not a native, Daniel Boone made his home in Kentucky, and he's still honored here. This is the actual rifle Boone used while exploring the Kentucky wilderness. On one side of the stock, he carved the likeness of Indians he encountered. On the other side, he expressed his feelings about the rifle, Boone's best friend. Another historic weapon is also on display in Frankfort. This is the dueling pistol used by Aaron Burr, which mortally wounded Alexander Hamilton. Statesman Henry Clay is honored here in the Capitol building as one of Kentucky's greatest heroes. Clay served as United States Senator, Speaker of the House, and Secretary of State. Known as the Great Compromiser, Clay was a champion of people's rights. But the highest tribute in Kentucky's Hall of Heroes is paid to two native sons who once faced each other in mortal combat and now stand together in a place of honor beneath the Capitol's great rotunda. Abraham Lincoln was born in what is now Kentucky's LaRue County. This magnificent statue of him is a major attraction of the Capitol building. Just a few feet away stands this statue of Jefferson Davis, who was born in what is now Todd County. There is a tradition surrounding the Lincoln statue which says that if you rub Lincoln's foot, it will bring good luck. And almost no one who visits the Capitol in Frankfort leaves without completing the ritual, even the little ones. Just outside the Capitol building stands the stately Kentucky governor's mansion. It is currently occupied by the Honorable Wendell H. Ford, but this evening Governor Ford is not at home. He is inside the Capitol at the legislature's joint session, where he is introducing tonight's American Enterprise Institute speaker.
The purpose of this evening is to introduce the first official event in Kentucky's celebration of its bicentennial era. It is fitting that we gather tonight in these chambers where in 1970 the General Assembly conceived and created the Kentucky Historical Events Celebration Commission, charging its members with the responsibility of planning and implementing a celebration to recognize and pay tribute to events in Kentucky's history. During our bicentennial celebration, over 3 million Kentuckians will have an opportunity to learn more about their history and their heritage. Equally important will be an opportunity for Kentuckians to play a role in projects that will enhance the future of this great state and bring lasting benefit to all within its borders. With this in mind, the Kentucky Historical Events Celebration Commission has diligently worked to develop a celebration to span the 3-year period from 1974 through 1976, when Kentucky joins its sister states in commemorating the 200th anniversary of the founding of the greatest nation on the earth. In preparation for the National Bicentennial, 16 outstanding men of letters have been commissioned by the American Enterprise Institute to present a distinguished lecture series designed to review past national accomplishments and chart courses for future achievements. This lecture series is dedicated to the belief that the competition of ideas is fundamental to a free society. Lectures are scheduled for such historic sites as Liberty Hall in Philadelphia, the House of Burgesses in Williamsburg, and the old Senate Chamber in the United States Capitol. Kentucky is honored to be selected for one of the lecture programs, and it is with humble pride that we accept our place in this stellar roster of historic sites and welcome today's lecturer, Dr. Gordon Stewart Wood. Dr. Wood is the author of The Creation of the American Republic, 1776-1787, and The Rising Glory of America, 1760-1820. An educator and a historian, Dr. Wood is a member of the American Historical Association, presently a professor of history at Brown University, Providence, Rhode Island. Dr. Wood has also served on the faculty of Harvard and the University of Michigan. Tonight, Dr. Wood will question whether or not the American experience provides a model for the evolution of political rights today and in the future. On behalf of the Commonwealth of Kentucky and its people, I want to offer a cordial welcome to all of our distinguished guests tonight and present to you Dr. Gordon Stewart Wood. Dr. Wood.
Governor Ford, Lieutenant Governor Carroll, Mr. Speaker, members of the General Assembly, ladies and gentlemen. It is indeed a great honor and delight for me to be here tonight talking to you. I'm especially delighted to be talking to politicians tonight, and I assume most of you are politicians. In fact, after being with some of you today, I know most of you are politicians. The reason I'm delighted is because what I want to say about the revolution has a great deal to do with politicians and with politics. I'm interested in the growth of democracy, which is what the rather elaborate title about political integration boils down to, Democracy and the revolution. We take democracy for granted. We assume that people have sets of clearly understood interests that will be readily expressed in politics, if only they are allowed to do so. The role of politicians in this process, when it is considered at all, is often thought of as that of passive agents riding the waves of the popular will. But politicians have a lot more to do with democracy than simply executing the passions and desires of the people. They not only help to shape and channel those desires and passions, they help to arouse and generate them. In fact, politicians were crucial in the beginning of our history in creating the collectivity we call the people as an active ingredient in politics. Democracy and politicians grew up together in our history and are inextricably bound together. Democracy is as much a product of electioneering politics as it is a prerequisite for such politics. Without politicians, there could be no democracy. Now, I don't want you to think that I decided on this topic and approach after I learned I would be talking to the General Assembly of Kentucky. I've thought about this subject a good many years and worked out some of these ideas long before I knew precisely who my audience would be. In fact, you may not be the best audience for my remarks. You already know how important you are. It's the world out there that needs to be reminded of the fact. The profoundest revolution of the past 200 years has been the introduction of ordinary people into the political process. For America and the rest of the Western world, this revolution began, or was most dramatically expressed, at the end of the 18th century, the age of the Democratic Revolution, as it has been appropriately called. The steady mobilization of the people into politics extended through a half-century in the United States following the Revolution. The process took much longer in Western Europe, requiring the greater part of the 19th century or more. And of course, for the rest of the world, the process is still going on. In fact, since 1945, with the emergence of new nations and the Third World, we are witnessing what has been called a participation explosion, the rapid incorporation into the political arena of people who had hitherto been outside of politics, in a hurried, even desperate effort by underdeveloped nations to catch up with modern democratic states. What made the American Revolution revolutionary was this very incorporation of people into politics. The Revolution created republics, commonwealths, which meant that the people were no longer to be considered subjects or something to be ruled, as they were under monarchies. They were thereafter to be considered citizens, participants themselves in the ruling process. This is what democracy has come to mean for us, an involvement of the people in politics, a meaning that we take so much for granted that we easily forget what a radical innovation in politics it was. More than anything else, this integration of common, ordinary people into politics, which began on a large scale in America at the end of the 18th century, is what sets apart the modern world from what went on before. Americans were in the vanguard of this development. Our assumption of the leadership of the free world, of the democratic nations, is not simply based on our preponderance of power, acutely visible since 1945. Ever since the Revolution, we have claimed the leadership of the free world. Even during the 19th century, when we were ourselves an underdeveloped nation, and our claims were being treated with bemused contempt by Europe. Our assertions of leadership were based on our priority in time. We were the first modern nation to have a democratic revolution and to establish a republic, in which citizenship and political participation belonged to the whole community. The American Revolution was about democracy, both a consequence and a cause of democracy. It came to mark a decisive change in the way politics were conducted in America. The revolution gave legitimacy to the involvement of common, ordinary people in politics. It was not, however, a matter simply of new people being legally given the right to vote in 1776. Although the franchise in colonial America was confined by property qualifications, as in 18th century England, property owning was so widespread in the colonies that the colonists enjoyed the broadest suffrage of any people in the world. Perhaps 80% of white adult males could vote. Yet the fact remains that most people in the colonial period did not exercise that right. The social structure and social values were such that colonial politics, at least compared to post-revolutionary America, were remarkably stable. And the numbers of people actually voting and participating in politics remained small, much smaller than even the percentages voting today. The legal exclusion of the propertyless from the franchise was based in the 18th century not on the fear that the poor might confiscate the wealth of the aristocratic few, but on the opposite fear, that the aristocratic few might manipulate and corrupt the poor for their own ends. Established social leaders expected deference from those below them and generally got it, and were habitually re-elected to political office. In the 18th century, there were no organized political parties and no professional politicians in today's sense of the terms. Established merchants, wealthy lawyers, large planters held the major offices and ran political affairs as part of the responsibility flowing from their elevated social positions. It was rare for a tavern keeper or a small farmer to gain a political office of any consequence. Men were granted political authority in accord not with their seniority or experience in politics, but with their previously established economic and social superiority. While some members of the elite sought the leverage of the English crown in politics, in gaining and wielding political power, others turned to the only alternative source of political authority recognized in 18th century Anglo-American political theory, the people. In the half century before the Revolution, these competing elites found themselves repeatedly invoking the people as tactical devices for offsetting the power of the crown and gaining political office, and in the process steadily mobilized elements of the population who had not earlier been involved in politics. This popularization of politics during the decades before the Revolution can be traced in various ways. Through the rise in voter participation, the increase in contested elections, the resort to caucuses, tickets, and other forms of political organization, and the growth of campaign propaganda and professional pamphleteering. This is how democracy began developing. Democracy was not the result of the people becoming spontaneously aroused and clamoring from below for a share of political authority. Rather, democracy was created from above. The people had to be cajoled, persuaded, even frightened into getting involved. Each competing faction tried to outdo its opponents in posing as a friend of the people, defending their rights and advancing their interests. Yet over time, what began as a pose eventually assumed a reality that had not been anticipated. The people, continually invoked, could not easily be laid to rest. By the middle decades of the 18th century, American politics was on the verge of a radical transformation that the Revolution both expressed and amplified. The Revolution made the people sovereign. Practices invoking and mobilizing the people into politics that had begun before the Revolution were now, with the Revolution, dramatically increased as political leaders competed with each other for power and the endorsement that being a friend of the people carried. First, the authority of the English government was challenged for its inability to represent not only the American people, but its own people as well. Then all authority was challenged by what eventually seemed to be ceaseless appeals to the people. For no institution in America appeared capable of embodying their will.
We are listening to Dr. Gordon S. Wood speaking before a joint session of the Kentucky State Legislature. Dr. Wood has been discussing the political integration of the common man into the American system of government. In just one moment, he continues. The state of Kentucky was in the unique position during the Civil War of being represented by a star in both the Confederate flag and the Union flag. Officially, Kentucky remained loyal to the North throughout the war, but a secessionist group in the southwest part of the state set up its own government and joined the Confederacy. The breakaway government was short-lived, but the Kentucky star remained on the Confederate flag. In the state capital at Frankfort, Dr. Gordon S. Wood is continuing his discussion of popular representation in American politics.
The Revolution so intensified the people's dominance in politics that there could never thereafter be any escaping from them. In America's new Republican consciousness, there could be nothing else in politics. No orders, no estates, no lords, no court, no monarch, not even rulers in a traditional sense, only the people. How they expressed themselves, how they participated in government, how they gave their consent, how they were represented, were thus crucial questions that preoccupied Americans in the Revolution and ever after. During the Revolution, Americans put together a conception of popular representation in government that we've never lost. The controversy and debate with England in the 1760s exposed a basic Anglo-American difference of experience and viewpoint concerning representation that only widened with the Revolution. The English clung to a belief in what they called virtual representation. England's 18th century electorate comprised only a small proportion of its population, and it bore little relation to changing concentrations of that population. The electoral districts formed a hodgepodge left over from centuries of English history. Thus, ancient rotten boroughs like Old Sarum, which were completely depopulated by the 18th century, sent members to the House of Commons, while newer large cities like Manchester and Birmingham sent none. Such seeming anomalies to us were justified on the not unreasonable grounds that each member of Parliament should represent not any particular locality, but the whole community. Parliament, as Edmund Burke said, was not a congress of ambassadors from different and hostile interests, but a deliberative assembly of one nation with one interest, that of the whole. To the English, what made a member of Parliament representative was not voting or the electoral process, which were incidental to representation in the English mind, but the mutuality of interests that presumably existed between the representative and the people, even though many of the people could not actually vote for the representative. Hence, the English thought of the members of Parliament as virtually representing all those who did not actually vote for them, including the colonists. Hence, out of this difference came the conflict over taxation without representation. To the Americans, whose experience in politics had developed differently from that of the mother country, representation possessed a peculiarly actual and local character. Their electoral districts were not the consequence of history going back to time immemorial, but were recent and regular creations that bore a distinct relation to changes in their population. When the colonists created new counties or new towns, they usually granted these new counties and towns immediate representation in their legislatures. Thus, Americans came to think of their legislatures, whether at the colony or state and later at the federal level, as precisely what Burke denied they should be, as congresses of ambassadors from different and contending localities and interests, all of whose consent had to be real and explicit. Hence, they could not accept the British contention that they were virtually represented, like the people of Manchester, in the English Parliament, and therefore capable of being taxed by it. The American colonists, in the course of a century and a half, developed such a keen awareness of the individuality of their interests that they simply could not understand how anyone could speak for them in whose election they had had no choice. Such a sense of particularity put a premium on voting as the sole measure of representation and on ensuring that all participated equally in the processes of consent. The ramifications of these ideas about representation were immense, and we are still today in our public life feeling the effects of them. They led first, during the Revolution and the years after, to heightened demands for an expansion of the suffrage. And secondly, they led to the growing notion of one man, one vote, which has resulted in our continual attempts to bring representation of localities into proportion with shifts in population. Finally, the belief that voting itself was the sole criterion of representation has in time transformed all elected officials, including governors and members of upper houses, senates, into other kinds of representatives of the people, standing in a sometimes awkward relationship to the original houses of representatives. This extreme localism and actuality of representation had more than constitutional importance, however. It had social implications that had even more significance for the character of our politics. Even before the revolutionary turmoil had settled, some were arguing that mere voting by ordinary men was not a sufficient protection of ordinary men's interests, if it were only members of the elite who were being elected. It was coming to be thought that, in a society of diverse and particular interests, men from one class or group, however educated and respectable, could not be acquainted with the situation and needs of another class or group. Wealthy, college-educated lawyers or merchants simply couldn't know the concerns of poor farmers or small tradesmen. The logic of the actuality of representation brought out in the Revolution demanded that ordinary people be represented by ordinary people. Hence, it was not enough for elected officials to be simply for the people. They now had to be of the people as well. In South Carolina, in the early 1780s, we have a particularly illuminating example of the new attitudes being felt and expressed, involving the case of a William Thompson, an unknown Charleston tavern keeper. It seems that John Rutledge, a distinguished social and political leader in South Carolina, had sent a female servant to Thompson's tavern to watch a fireworks display from the roof of the tavern. Thompson refused the servant admittance to his tavern and sent her back to Rutledge, who was furious. Rutledge then requested that Thompson come to his house and apologize for this insult. Thompson refused, and believing his honor was affronted by Rutledge's arrogant request, he challenged Rutledge to a duel. Now, the social likes of Rutledge didn't duel with tavern keepers. So Rutledge went to the South Carolina House of Representatives, of which he was a member, and got the House to pass a bill banishing Thompson from the state for insulting a member of its government. Now that's one way to deal with those you don't like, but I don't recommend it. Thompson naturally did what well, I hope you don't have anybody in particular in mind for this banishment. Well, Thompson did the only thing he could do under the circumstances. He became a newspaper columnist. Well, he went to the press for his defense and he began writing articles. And in 1784, he wrote what can only be described as a classic expression of American egalitarian resentment against social superiority. A resentment voiced, as Thompson said, not on behalf of himself, but on behalf of the people, or, in Thompson's words, those more especially who go at this day under the opprobrious appellation of the lower orders of men. Thompson was not simply attacking the few aristocratic nabobs, as he called them, who had humiliated him, but was actually insulting the entire conception of a social hierarchy ruled by a gentlemanly elite. In fact, he turned the prevailing 18th century opinion upside down and argued that the social aristocracy was peculiarly unqualified to rule politically. Rather than preparing men for political leadership in a free government, said Thompson, and I'm quoting him here, signal opulence and influence, especially when united by intermarriage or otherwise, were really calculated to subvert republicanism. The persons and conduct of the South Carolina nabobs like Rutledge in private life may be unexceptionable and even amiable, but their pride, influence, ambition, connections, wealth, and political principles, argued Thompson, ought in public life ever to exclude them from public confidence. All that was now needed in Republican leadership, said Thompson, was being good, able, useful, and friends to social equality. For in a Republican government, consequences from the public opinion and not from private fancy. In sardonic tones, Thompson, in his newspaper article, recounted how he, a tavern keeper, a wretch of no higher rank in the Commonwealth than that of common citizen, had been debased by what he called those self-exalted characters who affect to compose the grand hierarchy of the state, for having dared to dispute with a John Rutledge or any of that nabob tribe. The experience had been degrading enough to Thompson as a man, but as a former militia officer, it had been, as he said, insupportable, indicating how revolutionary military service affected social mobility and social expectations. Undoubtedly, said Thompson, Rutledge had conceived me his inferior. But Thompson, like many others in these years, tavern keepers, farmers, petty merchants, small-time lawyers, former militia officers, could no longer, in Thompson's words, comprehend the inferiority. Likewise, not being able to comprehend their inferiority, many new politicians in the decades following the Revolution used the popular and egalitarian ideals of the Revolution to smash the older social hierarchy and bring ordinary people like themselves into politics.
Historian Gordon S. Wood has been commenting on the struggle between the aristocracy and the common man for representation in the early American political system. Dr. Wood is speaking from the Kentucky state capitol in Frankfort. In just one moment, he continues. The Kentucky governor's mansion is among the most elegant in the nation. The mansion was built of native limestone and is styled after Marie Antoinette's villa near the Palace of Versailles. For over 50 years, the mansion has been home to Kentucky's chief executives and their families. The building stands next to the state capitol, where Dr. Gordon S. Wood is continuing his lecture on the development of a broad electorate in American politics.
This democratization of politics involved not only the legal widening of the electorate, but the furthering and the extending to new limits of practices begun before the Revolution, inactivating those who legally could but often didn't vote. More and more offices, including judgeships, were made directly elective, and everyone, it seemed, was now running, not as earlier, simply standing for election to them. New acts of persuasion using cheap newspapers and mass meetings were developed, and politics assumed carnival-like characteristics that in time, during the 19th century, came to involve in participation higher percentages of the electorate than were ever again achieved in American politics. In such an atmosphere of stump speaking and running for office, the members of the older gentry were at a considerable disadvantage. In fact, by the early 19th century, in some parts of the country, being a gentleman or professing the characteristics of a gentleman became a liability in winning elections. And a member of the gentry campaigning for votes was forced to take off his white gloves if he wanted to beat the tavern keeper who was charging him with being an aristocratic dandy. Now, one of the most graphic examples of these sorts of changes in American politics was revealed in the 1868 election campaign for the 5th Congressional District of Massachusetts. Essex County, a former heart of Boston Brahminism, but by the mid-19th century, increasingly filled by Irish immigrants. The campaign was essentially between Richard Henry Dana Jr., a well-to-do and Harvard-educated descendant of a distinguished Massachusetts family and author of the book 2 Years Before the Mast, and Benjamin Butler, son of a boarding house keeper who had never been to college and was one of the most flamboyant demagogues American politics has ever produced. It was Butler who first used the term bloody shirt, and it was he who led in the House of Representatives, who led the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. He was later elected governor of Massachusetts in 1870. You can get some idea of Butler's standing among the Massachusetts elite by realizing that Butler was the first governor of Massachusetts in over 2 centuries not invited to a Harvard College commencement. In the campaign, Butler showed Dana what 19th century electoral politics was all about. While Dana was talking to little tea groups about bond payments, Butler was haranguing the Irish shoe workers of Lynn, Massachusetts, organizing parades, turning out the fire and police departments, hiring brass bands, distributing hundreds of pamphlets and torches, and charging his opponent with being a Beau Brummel in white gloves. Dana was simply no match for Butler. When Dana was finally forced to confront audiences of working men, he gave up talking about bonds, and he even stopped wearing his white gloves, trying desperately to assure his audiences that he too worked hard. All the while, Butler was making fun of these efforts of Dana, these frantic efforts to get down to the level of the people. At one point, Dana told the Irish shoe workers that when he spent 2 years before the mast as a young sailor, he didn't wear any white gloves either. At that time, he said, "I was just like you. I was just as dirty as any of you." Well, with such speeches, it's not surprising that Dana got less than 10% of the vote. The rise of this kind of egalitarian politics, expressed by the campaigning of Butler, was a result not only of an expanded electorate represented by new immigrant working men, but also of the final collapse of the older social hierarchy and the traditional belief in elite rule which Dana represented. It was these sorts of changes in the first half of the 19th century that made the rise of political parties both necessary and possible, and the United States was the first nation to develop modern political parties. Yet, and it's a mighty big yet, as we all know only too well, America's record of integrating people into politics has not been a success story. The great anomaly amidst all the revolutionaries' talk of equality, voting, and representation was slavery. Indeed, it was the revolution itself, not only with its appeal to liberty, but with its conception of citizenship of equal individuals, that made slavery in 1776 suddenly seem anomalous to large numbers of Americans. What had often earlier in the 18th century been taken for granted as part of the brutality of life and regarded as merely the most base and degraded status in a society of infinite degrees and multiple ranks of freedom and unfreedom, was now, through the revolution, made conspicuous and peculiar. In a republic, unlike a monarchy, there could be no place for degrees of freedom or degrees of dependency. In the North, where slavery was considerable but not deeply rooted, the exposure of the anomaly worked to abolish it. By 1830 in the northern states, there were less than 3,000 black slaves out of a northern black population of over 125,000. In the South, the suddenly exposed anomaly of slavery threw Southern whites, who had been in the vanguard of the revolutionary movement and the most fervent spokesmen for its libertarianism, onto the defensive, and gradually separated them from the mainstream of America's egalitarian developments. Yet the very egalitarianism of America's Republican ideology that undercut the rationale of slavery worked at the same time to inhibit the integration of the free black man into the political nation. Since Republican citizenship implied equality for all citizens, a person once admitted into the political process was put on a level with all other citizens and was regarded as being as good as the next one. With the spread of these Republican assumptions, Northern whites began to view black voters with increasing apprehension, unwilling to accept the equality that the suffrage and citizenship now dictated. By 1800, in many states of the North, free Negroes possessed the right to vote, often as a result of the general extension of the franchise, which took place during the Revolution, and they exercised it in some areas with particular effectiveness. But in subsequent years, after 1800, as the electorate continued to expand, both through changes in the law and the mobilization of new voters, blacks found themselves being squeezed out. There is perhaps no greater irony in the democratization of American politics in the first half of the 19th century than the fact that as the white man gained the vote, the black man lost it. In state after state in the North, during the heyday of Jacksonian democracy, white populist majorities moved to eliminate the remaining property restrictions on white voters, while at the same time concocting new restrictions to take away the franchise from Negro voters, who had in some cases exercised the vote for decades. No state admitted to the Union after 1819 allowed blacks to vote. By 1840, 93% of northern free Negroes lived in states which completely or practically excluded them from the suffrage and hence participation in politics. This exclusion of blacks from politics was largely a consequence of white fears of equality that Republican citizenship demanded. But it was also a product of competitive democratic politics. In some states, like Pennsylvania, Negro exclusion was the price paid for lower-class whites gaining the right to vote, universal manhood suffrage having been opposed on the grounds it would add numerous blacks to the electorate. In other states, like New York,
as the number one of the whites
the
not
franchise
directly
was an
positioned,
effective
giving
way
Allen
for
plenty of
Democratic
time
Party majorities to
Allen,
eliminate once and
tapping it
for
down the
all
sideline.
blocks
Look
of
at the
Negro
whites
voters who tended
going
to vote for first Federalist and then Whig candidates.
All goes out of
Since the
play.
Democratic Party, as the spokesman for the popular cause against elitism, was in the forefront of the move to expand the suffrage, It simply seemed to be good politics for the party not only to attract new voters to its ranks, but to take away voters who supported its opponents. It was these sorts of political pressures, then, that led to the peculiar situation in some states of immigrant aliens being granted the right to vote before they became citizens, while Negroes born and bred in the United States had their right to vote abolished, a development often based on a shrewd assessment by politicians of what respective party the new immigrants and the blacks supported. For a Republican society, it was an impossible situation, and Americans wrestled with it for over a half-century. Federal officials in the first half of the 19th century could never decide the precise status of free Negroes, sometimes arguing that blacks were not citizens and having the right to vote, but were citizens and having the right to secure passports. Others tried to discover for free blacks some sort of intermediate legal position as denizens, standing between aliens and citizens. But the logic of Republican equality would not allow for such distinctions. And sooner or later, many sought escape from the dilemma posed by Negro disfranchisement by denying citizenship outright to all blacks, whether slave or free, a position Chief Justice Taney tried to establish in the Dred Scott decision of 1857. The suffrage had become so equated with representation in America that if a person was not granted the right to vote, then he thereby was not represented in the community. And not being represented in a Republican community was equivalent to not being a citizen. Enslaved blacks without liberty and free blacks without citizenship were such contradictions of the revolutionary ideals that sooner or later those contradictions had to tear the country apart.
Dr. Gordon Wood has been discussing the political integration of the common man into American politics. In just one moment, he will continue his address from the state capitol at Frankfort, Kentucky. In a state noted for famous sons, no one is more highly honored in Kentucky than Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln was born on a 300-acre farm known as Sinking Spring, just about in the center of Kentucky. He was named for his grandfather, who was killed in an Indian ambush in 1786. The one-room cabin in which Lincoln was born is now a national shrine, housed within a large marble memorial building. In the state capitol at Frankfort, our AEI lecturer, Dr. Gordon S. Wood, has been discussing the period in American history in which Abraham Lincoln played a vital role. We now rejoin Dr. Wood.
When Northerners came to debate methods of Southern Reconstruction at the end of the Civil War, they moved reluctantly but steadily toward Negro enfranchisement, impelled both by the logic of the persisting ideals of the Revolution and by the circumstances of politics. Although some historians have believed that the Republican Party's espousal of Negro suffrage in the late 1860s was based on a cynical desire to recruit new voters to the party, it obviously meant much more than that. For in terms of political expediency alone, Republican sponsorship of Negro suffrage ran the risk in the North of what we've come to call white backlash. Many advocates of Negro suffrage sincerely believed, as the abolitionist Wendell Phillips put it, that America could never be truly a united nation until every class God has made, from the lakes to the Gulf, has its ballot to protect itself. Yet there can be no doubt that black enfranchisement after the Civil War was fed, like all reforms, by political exigencies, and that many Northerners and Republicans favored it grudgingly only as a means of preventing the resurgence of an unreconstructed Democratic South that would threaten the dominance of the Republican Party. Hence, there resulted an awkward gap between the 14th Amendment, on the one hand, which defined citizenship for the first time and gave it a national emphasis which it had hitherto lacked, and the 15th Amendment, on the other hand, which enfranchised the Negro, but unfortunately linked his enfranchisement not to his citizenship, but to his race, a linkage which allowed states to impose any voting qualifications they chose, as long as they were not based on race, creating a tangled situation that 20th century Americans are still trying to unravel. Although we have hesitated to make the connection between citizenship and the right to vote explicit and unequivocal, everything in our history has pointed toward that connection. During the past decade or so, largely under the impetus of the civil rights movement, but going beyond that, we have witnessed a heightened interest in political and voting rights and have drawn out the logic of principles concerning the suffrage and representation first articulated in the Revolution 200 years ago. The various Voting Rights Acts and the Anti-Poll Tax Amendment of the mid-1960s were based on a deeply rooted belief that no nation like ours could in conscience exclude any of its citizens from the political process. It was the same legacy from the Revolution that led the Supreme Court in a series of reapportionment decisions to apply the idea of one man, one vote to congressional and state legislative electoral districting, the effects of which I'm sure you're well aware of. Large and unequal campaign contributions are of such concern to us precisely because they seem to negate the effects of an equal suffrage and to do violence to equality of participation in the political process. Despite an electorate that at times seems apathetic, our present obsession with the suffrage and the actuality and equality of consent has never been greater. Such an obsession naturally puts a terrific burden on our political system, but it is a burden we should gladly bear, and many other nations would love to have it. For it bespeaks an underlying popular confidence in the processes of our politics that surface events and headlines, news headlines, make us all too easily ignore. In fact, our obsession with the suffrage and the formal rights of consent have assumed such a transcendent significance for us that it has sometimes obscured the substance of democratic politics and has led us into exaggerating the real power of the legal right to vote. The suffrage has become for us such a symbol of citizenship that its possession seems necessarily to involve all sorts of other kinds of rights. Hence, acquiring the vote has often seemed an instrument of reform, a means of solving complicated social problems. The women's rights movement of the 19th century, premised on the belief, as one woman put it in 1848 at the outset, that there is no reality in any power that cannot be coined into votes, came to focus almost exclusively on the gaining of the suffrage. And when the 19th Amendment, giving women the franchise, was finally ratified in 1920 and did not lead to the promised revolution, the sense of failure set the feminist movement back at least a half century, from which it has, as you know, only recently been recovering. This sort of formal integration into the political process through the suffrage continues even today to be regarded as a kind of panacea for our social ills. Certainly this assumption lay behind our response to the youth rebellions of the late 1960s and the eventual adoption of the 26th Amendment, granting 18-year-olds the vote. This special fascination with politics and this reliance on political integration through voting as a means of solving social problems are legacies of our revolution. They are as alive now as they were 200 years ago. The revolution not only brought ordinary people into politics, but it created such a confidence in the suffrage as the sole criterion of representation that we have too often forgotten just what makes the right to vote workable in America. Hence, in our dealings with newly developed nations, we are too apt to believe that the mere institution of the ballot in a new state will automatically create a viable democratic society, and are confused and disillusioned when this really happens. The point is that we've got the relationship backwards. It is not the suffrage that gives life to our democracy. It is our democratic society that gives life to the suffrage. We have a society permeated by the belief in, and to an extraordinary extent, by the reality of equality. And it is this egalitarian society that makes our reliance on the ballot operable. As historians in the past 2 decades have only begun to discover, it was not the breadth of the franchise in the 19th century that created democratic politics. The franchise was already broad, even in colonial times. Rather, it was the egalitarian processes of politics that led to the mobilization of voters and the political integration of the nation. It was the work of countless politicians recruited from all levels of the society and representing many diverse elements, vying with each other and attempting to win elections by exhorting and pleasing their electors that has, in the final analysis, shaped our democratic system. Any state can grant the suffrage to its people overnight, but it cannot thereby guarantee it to itself a democratic polity. As our history shows, such a democracy requires generations of experience with electoral politics. And more important, it requires the emergence of political parties and egalitarian politicians, none of whom have too much power and most of whom run scared. Politicians whose maneuvering for electoral advantage, whose courting of the electorate, and whose passion for victory result in the end in grander and more significant developments than they themselves can foresee or even imagine. Politicians are at the heart of our political system, and insofar as it is democratic, they have made it so.
We have just heard a lecture by Dr. Gordon S. Wood on the revolution and the political integration of the enslaved and disenfranchised. Dr. Wood traced the development of voting rights for the masses in America and the effects this has had on our political system. Tonight's lecture is one of a series presented by the American Enterprise Institute, dealing with the many aspects of the American Revolution and the meaning of that revolution for modern America. If you would like a copy of Dr. Wood's lecture or copies of the entire series, write the American Enterprise Institute. That's AEI, Post Office Box 19191, Washington, D.C. 236. Until next time, this is Vermont Royster. Thank you for joining us.